Tuesday evenings were always a rush, particularly on the second Tuesday of each month when my club meeting kicked off at 6:30. Hannah and I typically walked through the door around 5 o'clock or 5:30, giving me just enough time to catch my breath. Since the club meeting included dinner, I didn't have to worry about cooking, but Hannah, my wife of 4 years, always had a knack for coming up with last-minute tasks for me to handle before I could leave. Yet, the real battle was with myself. Hannah, who was 3 months pregnant and dealing with wild hormones, was still the mesmerizing woman I married. Now, with the radiant glow of impending motherhood, it was especially tough to leave her side, even for a few hours. She was perfect in my eyes. At 5'3" and weighing 110 pounds, with her light brown hair and those striking blue eyes, she was a sight to behold. But it wasn't just her looks. I admired her sharp wit and keen observational skills. Despite my deep affection for her, I had to be out the door by 6:10 to make it to the meeting on time. This meant a quick shower, getting dressed, giving Hannah a swift kiss, and heading out. Typically, I didn't get back home until after 11 o'clock, often closer to midnight. Tonight seemed like it would follow the usual pattern. After a speedy shower, I threw on some slacks and a sports shirt, grabbed my briefcase, and made my way through the kitchen to the garage. I planted a kiss on the back of Hannah's neck, gave her a reassuring squeeze, and reluctantly left. It was tempting to skip the meeting, not just for Hannah, but because I had an ongoing project in the garage, installing a baby monitor for the nursery. I estimated it would take about 30 minutes to finish, and then I could proudly show it off to Hannah. She always appreciated my small achievements, and I didn't mind the praise, even if it was somewhat misplaced. A little ego stroking from her never hurt. Settling into the car, I activated the garage door opener and started the engine. With the car purring, I placed my briefcase on the seat beside me and double-checked that I had everything. Cell phone, calculator, notebook, all set. I reversed out of the garage and down the driveway, waving to Hannah through the kitchen window as she washed dishes. She waved back as I reached the street. Just before shifting the car into gear or closing the garage door with the remote, my cell phone rang, stopping me in my tracks. As I answered, I glanced up to wave to Hannah one more time, but she had already disappeared from view. The caller informed me that tonight's meeting was canceled. Our president, Samuel, along with Mason and Eli, had been called out of town. With the key officers absent, they decided to cancel this month's gathering. There was nothing urgent planned, so I was relieved to have the evening free. I simply reversed back into the garage, noticing Hannah's absence from the kitchen window. After pulling into the garage and closing the door, I took a moment to relax in the car. I decided to order pizza for dinner, giving me time to focus on finishing the monitor. All the components for the camera and the nursery were in place, save for some garage connections and final testing. The nursery's cosmetic adjustments were minor, and the camera, discreetly mounted in a corner, had gone unnoticed by Hannah for 10 days due to its small size. I'd handle those tasks later. Hannah had mentioned how convenient a nursery monitor would be for checking on the baby while it napped, which inspired me to wire the house. I also opted to install sound monitors in each room. The idea for the visual monitor came from some discarded equipment a friend had. The main controls were in our bedroom, but I installed a secondary set in the garage, where I often worked. Equipped with speakers and an old TV acting as the video monitor, this setup allowed flexible monitoring from anywhere in the house. The project was nearly complete, needing only a minor adjustment before I could surprise Hannah and unwind for the night. I decided to finish the work before relaxing. Stepping out of the car, I began checking my setup. After about 20 minutes, everything seemed to function properly. I tested the sound feeds one by one, starting with the living room. They all worked perfectly, with impressive sensitivity. I could even hear Hannah showering in the master bedroom. I set them all to be live and feeding into the garage, then moved on to the final connections for the video monitor. Lost in my wiring checks, I suddenly heard someone speaking through the living room speaker. It sounded like Hannah on the phone. Curious, I turned up the volume and found the clarity impressive. The $12 spent on the speakers was indeed a bargain. Hannah's voice came through, asking someone named Edward to be there by 7 o'clock. Edward responded, "Okay, love, I'll see you then. Don't you dare be late. We won't have near enough time as it is. And no, don't expect a repeat." Hannah giggled and hung up. What was that about? Who was Edward? The only Edward I knew was Edward Thompson, Samantha's husband. Samantha, Hannah's college roommate and best friend, had a fun-loving husband. I guessed they were planning something for Samantha. Well, I'd find out soon enough. With only 15 minutes until 7 o'clock, I set aside my thoughts and switched on the camera in the baby's room. Leaning back, a satisfied smile crept onto my face as the monitor displayed the spare bedroom. The camera focused on the neatly made queen-sized bed, a surprising sight since Hannah never made the bed unless we had guests. Adjusting the video controls, I zoomed in and out, capturing the entire room except for the corner where the camera was mounted. Content with the clear image showing the door, window, closet, and bed, I began tidying up my workbench, pleased with my handiwork. I grabbed a beer from the old refrigerator and settled into my $150 recliner, a garage edition Hannah wouldn't allow inside the house. As I finished my beer and thought about ordering pizza, the front doorbell rang, pulling me from my thoughts. Moments later, I heard Hannah greet someone with a tone of impatience. She invited Edward in, mentioning they had until 10:30. "Until then, I'm all yours," she said, her voice dripping with seduction. The shock wasn't from her words, but from the husky, intimate tone she used, one I only heard in our bedroom. I nearly choked on my beer. The front door closed and Hannah's voice continued, teasing Edward about the bulge in his pants. She told him it looked good and asked him to give her a proper hello. Edward responded, and soon after I heard grunts and moans. Then Hannah directed him to the bedroom, saying she had it all set up for them. My stomach turned. Was Hannah leading Edward to our bedroom? Confused and unsure, I felt the urge to storm into the kitchen and throw Edward out. But could this really be happening? I took a deep breath. It couldn't be what it seemed. Hannah and I were deeply in love, and I was certain she was as faithful as I was. She often teased me about admiring other women, but it was harmless fun. I never felt the urge to stray, and we were compatible lovers. She always seemed satisfied, enjoying our intimate moments. This had to be a misunderstanding. We were best friends, expecting a baby together. Sitting in the recliner, I noticed movement on the baby's room monitor. The door opened, and Hannah guided Edward into the room with the prepared bed. She led him to the other side near the window, and then positioned herself in front of the closed closet doors, looking almost directly into the camera. Hannah wore her old Saturday morning robe, which barely reached her mid-thigh. Her hair was styled in an elegant bun, and her makeup was just right, making her look like a princess despite the shabby robe. She wore the high-heeled slippers I had given her for her birthday, which I hadn't seen her wear since that night. Realizing this, I felt tears welling up. This couldn't be real. Hannah stood confidently, making eye contact with Edward. Her hand slowly rose to her robe's neckline, holding it closed with her left hand, while her right hand unsnapped each button, teasing him with glimpses. Once all the buttons were undone, she brought her right hand back to her throat, and with both hands, peeled the robe open. She stood for a moment, framed by the robe, then let it drop to the floor. She was wearing the lingerie I had given her on Valentine's Day, which I hadn't seen since. She maintained eye contact with Edward, raising a hand to beckon him. As he approached, I saw the stunned look on his face. He stammered, "I was expecting to be with you tonight, but you made this really special." He praised her beauty, saying, "God, you're beautiful." Both disrobed. Emerging from my daze, I knew I needed proof of what was happening. I quickly and quietly grabbed a fresh SD card from the living room, returned to the garage, connected it to the monitor, and switched everything back on. Tears filled my eyes as I watched them move to the bed and embrace. They engaged in an intimate act that seemed to last forever, with Edward relentlessly thrusting into her. After about 15 minutes, Hannah tried to pull away. Staring at the screen, I stood up and paced, knowing that confronting them would lead to violence. I felt sick and paralyzed, unable to decide my next move. "Edward, unless you want William to walk in on us, you have to go now," Hannah said. She bent, picked up his clothes, and handed them to him. Gathering her lingerie, she placed everything on the dresser. I watched as Hannah threw on her old robe and stripped the sheets off the bed, not waiting for Edward to finish dressing. She bundled them up and took them to the washer in the laundry room between the kitchen and garage. When she returned to the living room, Edward was there, boasting and suggesting they talk about doing it again. "It's just the one time," she stated firmly, "and only because of our deal." Edward nodded, adding that perhaps it was also for old time's sake. He agreed it was a one-time thing, but hinted that if she ever remembered how good it was, they could consider doing it again. I heard another sloppy kiss before Edward's footsteps faded towards the door. Hannah's voice carried a mix of impatience and something else I couldn't identify at the time, nor did the sigh she let out as she followed him to the door. Feeling utterly sick, I reclined back in the ratty old chair, staring at the now empty bedroom on the monitor. Checking my watch, I saw it was 10:37. They had adhered to their schedule perfectly. I could make out Edward mumbling something at the door, and Hannah replied, reiterating it was a one-time thing because of their old agreement. She stressed that I was her husband, her lover, the man she wanted in her life. She expressed uncertainty about why they did it now, and mentioned that despite Samantha's approval, she was her best friend, and more important than an affair. She questioned Edward's feelings about Samantha. I couldn't hear his reply clearly, but I heard another kiss, and then the door closing quietly. Almost immediately, I heard the lock click home. If I hadn't been so overwhelmed with tears and despair, the exhausted tone in Edward's voice after his tryst with my wife might have been laughable. But nothing was funny at that moment. After the door shut, Hannah reappeared in the spare bedroom. I couldn't think of it as the baby's room anymore. She quickly inspected the room, making sure nothing was out of place after their encounter. Gathering up her clothes, she disappeared into the hallway, and I soon heard her in our bedroom. I listened as she showered, then the bed rustled. It sounded like she had gone to bed. Glancing at my watch, I saw it was almost 11 o'clock. I just sat there, staring into space with no clue about where my life and marriage were headed. All I knew was that I felt heartbroken. Thoughts raced through my mind, some trying to find excuses for Hannah's actions, others countering those excuses, and still others questioning what I had done to drive her to another man. Sometime after midnight, I wearily turned off the electronics and entered the house through the garage door. Heading directly to the master bedroom, I passed the spare room where Hannah had been with Edward. I glanced in. It was just as I had last seen it on Monday evening. The bed was stripped, and nothing seemed out of place. No evidence of what had happened. Groaning to myself, I entered my bedroom. Glancing at my sleeping wife, I went to the bathroom, brushed my teeth, and handled my business. Stripping off my clothes, I checked the dirty clothes hamper before dropping them in. It was empty, no soiled lingerie. When I climbed into bed, Hannah rolled over and threw an arm over me. She sleepily asked how my night had been. After a moment's silence, I told her it had been very traumatic, but I would explain later. Usually she would snuggle up to me, but tonight she just lay quietly, pulled her arm back, and rolled over with her back to me. She seemed to fall back asleep immediately, though her breathing suggested she might still be awake. I rolled away from her and stared into the darkness. I don't know how much I slept that night. I couldn't remember actually sleeping at all. When the alarm went off, I just lay there, too drained to go to work. Telling Hannah I thought I had the flu, I stayed in bed until I heard her car leave for work. Getting up, I carefully searched Hannah's dresser, making sure not to disturb anything. In the bottom drawer, folded and hidden in a paper bag under some sweaters, was the lingerie she wore for Edward. I pulled it out, noting the dampness in the ruined underwear. After calling in sick to my boss, I played back the tape from the previous night. Initially, I fast-forwarded through it, avoiding a rehash of the experience and ensuring the tape's quality. As time passed, I noticed details I had initially overlooked. I spent the morning scrutinizing the video and made 2 duplicate copies, along with 2 phone calls. Realizing I hadn't eaten since lunch the previous day and feeling too queasy for breakfast, I skipped meals. Hannah arrived home at her usual time around 4:30. When she came in to kiss me, I turned away, prompting a puzzled look from her. At 5:30, I decided it was time to confront the issue head-on. There was no sense in delaying further, only causing more distress for myself. I asked Hannah if she could spare a few minutes to see what I had been working on for the baby monitor we were discussing. She responded by saying we could talk after dinner because she was about to start preparing it. I picked up my phone and asked her dinner preference. She suggested Chinese, and I promptly ordered it for delivery. Then I brought her into the bedroom and demonstrated the controls on the console behind the door. I left the sound on, moving from room to room while communicating with her over the monitor. Although she couldn't respond, The smile on her face upon my return indicated that it was working better than planned. Turning on the video feature, I instructed her to wait and watch. I then stepped into the spare room and stood where she had been the previous night. Mimicking a slow bump and grind, I returned to our bedroom. She exclaimed, "William, that's perfect. When did you get this set up?" I responded that I got it going that afternoon. Actually, the previous night. She wore a puzzled smile, seemingly trying to recall when I had time to set it up. I told her there was one more thing to show her and led her to the garage. I explained that since I spent a lot of time there, I had set up something special. I thought installing a monitoring system to keep an eye on the baby while she was out was a smart move. So I set up the system in the garage, remembering something from the night before. "Let me show you how it works," I said, plugging a USB drive into the TV. "Watch the bedroom and see what happens," I told her. The screen displayed our bedroom, initially empty, but with an unmade bed. I then used the remote to turn on the TV, and the image changed to show Hannah on her knees before Edward. Her face went pale, and she wobbled, trying to regain her balance. She looked at me in shock, and I just stared into her eyes, fast-forwarding the video briefly. I gestured for her to watch the screen again. When she turned back, she saw Edward pulling at her underwear. Although there was no sound, we could see Hannah say something to him. We both watched in silence until we heard a small scream, which I now realized was from pain. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw tears streaming down Hannah's face and noticed her flinch at the rough way Edward had forced himself on her. Stopping the video, I asked if she wanted to see more. She just looked at me helplessly. I called Hannah into the house, needing to have a serious talk. We went into the kitchen, where I sat her down at the table and took a seat next to her. Through her tears, Hannah mumbled that she could explain, and I told her I needed to hear it. I asked her about a promise she had made to Edward back in college. I wanted to know how long ago she had pledged herself to him. Hannah started to explain, saying it wasn't as simple as it seemed. She and Edward had dated while he had a reputation as a ladies' man. She mentioned that she started rooming with Samantha, and Edward began dating both of them for a while. She elaborated on the dynamics between the three of them, saying that Edward and Samantha were moving toward a serious relationship. Hannah recounted a conversation with Edward one night in her room, where things got more risque as they drank. She revealed to Edward that her fear of getting pregnant was the only reason they hadn't gotten closer. Edward expected his partners to be on the pill, but Hannah was reluctant to be too liberal with her favors. She continued, explaining that they argued, and she wrote a promissory note stating that if she could be sure he couldn't get her pregnant, she would spend a night with him. I stared at her in disbelief. "How long ago was this?" I asked. "About 6 years," she replied. She went on to say that the note had become a joke between Edward and her ever since. "We told Edward and Samantha about her pregnancy 2 weeks ago. After the initial congratulations, Edward and I went to the garage to check on a problem he was having. While we were gone, Samantha confronted Hannah, telling her the promissory note was now due. Hannah was shocked that Samantha even knew about it and stunned that she was serious. When Edward and I returned, I remembered a case of Dutch beer I was going to bring to the cookout. Insisting it would only take a few minutes, I left to get the beer. While I was gone, Samantha brought up the note again. Hannah was surprised to find that Edward also believed it would be honored. He was indignant when he heard Hannah was considering backing out of the agreement. After 3 hours of steady drinking, Hannah reluctantly agreed to honor the old note. By the time I returned, it had been decided that she would entertain Edward that night. I told Hannah that her story was one of the strangest I'd ever heard, and that it was hard for me to accept. I asked her who the father of her baby was. Hannah shrank, and tears started falling again. My next question was about how many other promises she had made and fulfilled. Hannah screamed at me, insisting there were none, and pleading, "William, don't. I love you, William." She assured me it was a one-time mistake and wouldn't happen again. She dropped to her knees, covering her face in tears, begging me to listen. I asked if I could ask her some questions and if she would be honest. She agreed, urging me to ask. Hannah emphasized that it was a one-time thing, not something she wanted to do. She admitted that it seemed unbelievable to her now, but I meant more to her than anything. I looked at her kneeling before me, my heart aching. This was my best friend, the person I wanted to spend my life with, but I needed to know who she really was. I asked if she could have said no to this. She said she could have, but felt her honor was at stake. Hannah explained that she was afraid to tell me, fearing I wouldn't understand. She felt that if I were in her place, I would have done the same. She clarified that she was drunk when the agreement was made, but didn't discard it when sober. When it was made, she didn't know me, and it wasn't done to cheat on me. It was a promise to a dear friend, and she believed it was right at the time. After thinking it over, I told her she could have said no after sobering up, but felt it was right and owed a debt to the man her friend had become. I asked if that was correct, and she confirmed it. I asked her to think carefully if this was something she was looking forward to, and she shouted that she began thinking it was just a joke. However, she quickly understood it wasn't a joke. It was all too real. Staring into her eyes, I asked if she had anticipated this moment over the past 2 weeks. Hannah took a deep breath and said no, explaining that she felt obligated to do it, not that it brought her any pleasure. As I continued to look at her, she lowered her gaze and whispered, "Okay, yes, William. I guess I was looking forward to it, but not in the way you think." She clarified that she never wanted to cheat on me. However, faced with the situation, she felt she had no choice but to go through with it and thought she might as well enjoy it if she had to. She emphasized it wasn't because I wasn't enough for her, but because she felt bound to honor her promise. Taking a shaky breath, I exhaled slowly and reminded her of a memory from about 6 weeks ago. I had called her on my cell phone while driving back from a conference. We had teased each other for a bit before I suggested meeting at the Holiday Inn in Atherton for a weekend getaway. I asked if she remembered, and she nodded with a faint smile, saying it was a great weekend. I then asked if she had wanted to make it special for us, for me. Hannah, now smiling more genuinely, said, "Of course I did, and it was a great time." I followed up by asking if she recalled what she packed for that weekend. She mentioned bringing a nice dress for dancing, which we did, and some comfortable clothes for walking. I told her to hold on and explained that I needed to show her something on the video to help her understand what I was getting at. I walked back to our bedroom, making sure she was following me, and she was. I powered up the bedroom TV and pressed play on the remote. The scene of Hannah kneeling before Edward played again. She stood and turned to the bed, facing the camera. I asked her what she was wearing, and blushing, Hannah replied that she had on her white lingerie set from Valentine's Day. She mentioned she had never worn it for me, except when she modeled it after I gave it to her. Hannah explained that she hadn't found an occasion to wear it, and then looked puzzled. I reminded her that she didn't wear it at the Holiday Inn. She had changed into a peasant skirt and a white blouse, later wearing white cotton underwear and a bra, probably the same ones she had on now. I asked if she remembered what she wore to bed that night, and in a small voice, she said her Donald Duck t-shirt. Looking into her eyes, I pointed out that she had said our holiday weekend was special, and that the date with Edward wasn't. Yet she wore one of the nicest things she owned, something I had bought for us to share, for Edward, and not for me. "How special do you think that makes me feel?" I asked. Hannah's shoulders slumped, and she just looked at me. I continued, "If I didn't love you, we wouldn't be living in this house together. If I didn't think you were special, I wouldn't be married to you." I recounted an unexpected call that canceled my meeting the previous night, leading me into one of the worst nightmares I could imagine. Edward, one of my best friends, if not my very best friend, showed up when I should have been in my meeting. My wife Hannah greeted him at the door and took him to a room she had prepared for a tryst, giving him a strip show. I saw her dress in a way she hadn't for me in over a year. When I questioned her about it, she claimed the meeting wasn't important to her, but she had gone to great lengths to dress up, do her hair, and apply makeup, things she hadn't done for me in ages. This indicated that the meeting was crucial to her, considering it a treat she had to prepare for. It also suggested that her time with me was ordinary and of much lesser value. I saw her doing things for Edward that she only did for me on special occasions, if at all, and doing some things for him that she had refused to do with and for me. Tears filled Hannah's eyes and she quickly blinked them away. She kept insisting that it wasn't what it seemed and declared her love for me, emphasizing how much I meant to her. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I looked at her and said I wasn't sure what our next steps would be. However, I mentioned that I intended to call Edward and Samantha over for a discussion that evening. I asked Hannah if Samantha knew about everything, and then I proceeded to dial their number. Samantha answered, and I requested they come by for a brief meeting later. While I was on the phone, Hannah answered the door for the Chinese food delivery. Despite having no appetite, I forced myself to eat, knowing it was going to be a long and emotional night. Hannah played with her food, and for a brief moment, I almost believed her assurances that it was a one-time incident and that she still loved me. At around 7:15, the doorbell rang. Before opening the door, I told Hannah that I suspected there was more to this situation than she might be aware of. As I welcomed Edward and Samantha inside, they both smiled at me, but I couldn't ignore the subtle, knowing glance they exchanged with Hannah. Edward, in particular, had a possessive look in his eyes directed at my wife, and I noticed Hannah cringe slightly under his gaze. As we all settled on the couch, I gestured for Hannah to sit next to Samantha, but she chose to sit in her recliner to the side. I talked about various topics, including the new monitoring system I had been working on, without revealing its full capabilities or what it had captured the previous night. Samantha and Edward seemed confused, questioning the purpose of the meeting. Eventually, I broached the subject, making a light-hearted offer of drinks to ease the tension. Everyone agreed, and I served each of them their preferred beverages: Samantha's white wine, Edward's Jack Daniels and 7-Up, Hannah's orange juice due to her pregnancy, and what appeared to be my gin and tonic but was just tonic water. I sat on a hassock near the TV, trying to keep my composure while observing everyone. Finally, I turned to Samantha and directly asked, "What was your motivation behind setting all this up?" She looked confused and asked me to clarify. I repeated, "Why did you go to such lengths to orchestrate everything?" As I finished, Edward choked on his drink. Shifting my gaze to him, I added, "I get why you would be interested, but is there more to it?" Trying to maintain eye contact with both women, I switched my focus between them. Addressing Edward, I voiced my concern about his reputation as a playboy, implying that another conquest didn't seem worth the risk. He stumbled over his words, trying to justify that he was at home the previous night when my meeting was canceled. He mentioned being in the garage during my appointment with Hannah and claimed he arrived to support his story by showing the live feed from the camera in the spare room, which I had set up before he came over. I commented on the impeccable timing and quality of the video, hinting at my suspicion. Hannah buried her face in her hands while Edward turned pale. Samantha, on the other hand, gave me a seductive smile. Continuing, I questioned the entire purpose behind this elaborate setup. Samantha crossed her legs, her foot bouncing nervously, and asked what I thought it meant. I responded, mentioning her and Edward's reputations, and noted that despite their openness, I had heard some rumors. I expressed relief that nothing had been said directly to us yet, but anticipated that might change soon. Samantha admitted this wasn't the best way to bring it up, but agreed it was time to address the matter. I glanced at my wife, Hannah, who looked utterly bewildered. Up to now, I thought she was in on this, but now I wasn't so sure. I explained that Samantha and Edward had been part of a key club for a couple of years. Every Friday night, they met with other couples. Each couple brought a house key with their address and dropped the keys into a barrel. After dinner, the wives would go home to prepare for a weekend with a new partner, while the husbands drew a key. If a husband drew his own key, he held it aside, pulled out another key, and dropped his wife's key back into the barrel. If they didn't like the address they drew, they could draw another key, but only twice. The men then had a drink before heading off for a weekend rendezvous, lasting the entire weekend, not just a few hours. Samantha and Edward, being close to us, led others to believe we were also involved in this key club. Many men had expressed interest in Hannah, not just Edward. As I laid out these details, the room went silent. Hannah stared at me, shocked and wide-eyed. Samantha wore a smug smile, her foot still bouncing. Edward looked relieved but still had a smug expression. "Before we go any further, Hannah, there's something you should know about your lover from last night," I said, my voice steady but filled with tension. Hannah's face paled once more as I recounted the situation. It was clear she didn't want to be reminded of the fragile state of our marriage. I mentioned Edward's physical attributes, and her face turned bright red as she buried it in her hands, stealing a glance at Edward, who had a triumphant grin. I knew I had to address his condescending attitude before the night ended. I explained that Edward was considered a prize in these key club drawings. All the wives eagerly awaited to see if they had drawn the highly regarded partner for the weekend. Glancing around the room, I added that Hannah had already experienced the best. Edward smirked at me, and when I looked at Samantha, she was smirking at Hannah, who seemed to be shrinking into her chair. She looked at me with a sickly expression. Leaning back on my seat, I took a long drink of my tonic, finding its bitterness a fitting match for the taste in my mouth. I let the silence linger, watching Edward still look smug, while Samantha seemed like she wanted to speak. I remained quiet, allowing the tension to build further. Samantha finally broke the silence, explaining that their arrangement added excitement to their marriages, keeping the spark alive. According to her, it prevented their relationships from becoming stale. She suggested that loosening up could boost our relationship, making us closer. Edward nodded in agreement, wearing his usual grin. Samantha continued, expressing her belief that it wouldn't harm our friendship and could even bring new ideas into our bedroom. She assured us there was no pressure and encouraged us to think about it, stating they would be there whenever we decided. Listening to Samantha's confession, I thanked her for her honesty, but made it clear that I had never considered such an arrangement and had no intention of doing so. I expressed that Hannah and I were intelligent, creative individuals who didn't need to resort to partner swapping to enhance our relationship. I emphasized our commitment to a more traditional and faithful union. However, my tone shifted to a more pressing issue. I pointed out that Edward's lack of safe practices deeply concerned me, especially with Hannah being pregnant. I stressed that she would need to visit a doctor immediately to check for STDs, creating a complicated and stressful situation for us. Until she was tested and cleared, we couldn't risk any intimacy. I made sure Hannah grasped the severity of the situation. Turning to our former friends, I conveyed my profound sense of betrayal, unsure who had hurt me more. Regardless, I stated that we needed to cease our gatherings indefinitely. I turned off the TV, ejected the USB drive, and handed it to Hannah. She grabbed some sheets of that day's unopened newspaper, lit a match, and set them ablaze in the fireplace, tossing the drive into the flames. We watched as the fire consumed it, leaving only ashes. When I turned back, I noticed that both Edward and Samantha were unconscious. I remarked that the chemical had taken effect, then made a call to Garcia. 3 hours later, at 11 p.m., the doorbell rang. I let Garcia in and pointed to the two limp bodies, confirming that the package was ready. Garcia asked if I had anything for him, and I gestured toward the bodies. He went outside and returned with several men. They picked up Samantha first, and as they moved toward Edward, I stopped them. Retrieving a baseball bat from upstairs, I said I needed a few swings. Garcia nodded, and they placed Edward on the ground. I explained my intention to target specific points: knees, ankles, and other sensitive areas, all executed quickly and precisely. Hannah stood there, her mouth open in shock. I expressed a desire to hear Edward scream, but acknowledged he was unconscious. The team took him away, and Garcia returned to thank me. I responded that it was my pleasure. Hannah remained seated, stunned. After Garcia left, the cold night air filled the room. Hannah approached me, asking what would happen to Edward and Samantha. I replied coldly that they were going to Mexico to help medical students with their training. Hannah, still reeling, asked what if someone searched for them. I assured her that Garcia would take care of everything. I coldly told her that eliminating them was necessary, expressing indifference to her feelings. I argued that my actions were justified, emphasizing that I had ensured their usefulness to society. Hannah was visibly shaken. I informed her that my earlier promise about resuming our relationship was a lie. The next morning, we would conduct a DNA test for the unborn child. If the results showed I was the father, I would assist with the birth, but we would not stay married. She wouldn't take any lovers until our son was 10 years old, or I would ensure she paid a heavy price. We would file for divorce the next day, with her getting the house and my financial support until she found a job. Hannah nodded, shocked by this side of me. I walked away, admitting I hadn't known I was capable of this either. The next day, we filed for divorce, and 3 weeks later, we received the DNA report confirming I was the father. Months later, we finalized the divorce, and 2 months after that, my son was born. I devoted myself to him, maintaining occasional contact with Hannah, but never rekindling any love for her. She honored our agreement, avoiding relationships, and I supported her financially until our son was old enough to care for himself. I didn't date during this time, focusing all my energy on my son.